So aggregate supply policy is basically, I guess, a subset of budgetary policy. It's a subset of it, and it's basically strategies by the government to try to improve supply side conditions. So we want to improve the production of goods and services. We want to increase our productive capacity. So the aim of those policies are, first, like, we want to reduce the production costs. So we want to get rid, or we want to minimize, cost push inflation. Okay? We want to make sure production is efficient, so allocatively efficient, so resources are allocated in the best way possible, but also technically efficient, so that we are being as productive as possible, maximizing our production with minimal inputs. We want to increase our productive capacity, so we want to increase the total amount that we can supply with our given resources and make sure that our GDP grows sustainably. Because let's say we have very, very strong aggregate demand, right? So let's say our aggregate demand, super strong, it's going really well. But if supply cannot keep up with that level of demand, then we're going to have problems. So what that's going to cause shortages. It's going to cause lots of inflation because of those shortages. And it can be really, really unsustainable. So we want to make sure supply can move with the levels of demand. We want to reduce structural unemployment. So if you don't remember what structural unemployment is, it's unemployment that's caused by stuff that's not related to the business cycle. So that includes seasonal unemployment. So seasonal is when you're unemployed because of at certain times of the year because of the season. So for example, a ski instructor. Next is hardcore unemployment. So that's when you're unemployed because of your personality, or you don't have this, I guess, you're not really suited for the job. So there are different types of structural unemployment, but the main reason for structural unemployment is when the skills of the people applying for the jobs don't match up with the skills that the employer wants. We want to make sure that we can improve our productive capacity, improve our efficiency, so that we can be internationally competitive. So if we're super efficient, it means that we can lower our prices and make our goods really appeal to international consumers. And overall, we want to increase aggregate supply. So like I said, make sure that it's in line with aggregate demand. Okay, quick meaning of productive capacity, because that's a really important concept when it comes to aggregate supply policies. So productive capacity, that's your absolute maximum level of production that any country can achieve, so can obtain from the available resources. So in the long term, Australia's economic growth, it's limited by our productive capacity. So if we're not able to expand our productive capacity, we cannot achieve sustainable economic growth. Okay, so let's do a little bit of a recap on efficiencies, because these are very important and they often do come up in SACs or exams. So allocative efficiency, that's when we try to make sure that resources are allocated in such a way that they provide a net benefit to society. So they're allocated in such a way that they satisfy the needs and wants of society, but at the same time, they maximize living standards. Okay, so if we are achieving allocative efficiency at this very point, and I was like, okay, let's reallocate resources, let's make a minor change, that would result in a suboptimal resource allocation. So any other way of allocating the resources would not maximize living standards. So that's allocative efficiency. So that one point where resources are allocated so that living standards are maximized. Okay, so next we have productive or technical efficiency. So this one's relatively straightforward. This is when you have businesses and they try to minimize input, maximize output. So they try to use as little resources as possible to produce as much as possible. So they're more productive. Dynamic efficiency, so that's when firms or industries, they're being really adaptive. So they're they respond very quickly to changes in demand, changes in market conditions, and the way that they use resources. So an example of dynamic efficiency is, let's say, it could be because of taste. So let's say summer's almost over, winter's coming, right? Consumers' tastes start to shift toward winter stuff. So stuff like jumpers, stuff like jackets, and so on. So people, suppliers, which are making clothes, they should be able to quickly shift their resources from making, let's say, swimwear to making like jackets and hoodies and stuff like that, which consumers actually want at that time. So they need to be very dynamic. They need to change the resources. Another way of being dynamically efficient is when consumers start to become a little bit more sustainable, so climate conscious, environmentally conscious, right? So producers try to advertise, so they try to make goods and services from stuff that is environmentally friendly. So they're like, oh, this tray is made entirely from bamboo, not plastic, and so on. So you are being dynamically efficient, changing your resources, changing what you produce, how you produce it, to make sure that consumers' tastes, their needs and wants are met. So that maximizes satisfaction. Okay, so again, recap on eco goals. So we want strong and sustainable growth. If we can increase our productivity and productive capacity, it will help us achieve not only strong growth, but sustainable growth as well. So we want to keep inflation in check. Low inflation, so we want to make sure that higher productivity and all of that, that gives us a reduction in production costs. So we want to reduce cost inflation. Full employment, we want to make sure that resources are efficient. So we want to make sure that labor is really, really efficient so that there's more demand for that labor over the long term. An example of that could be, let's say, we have, let's say, the car industry, right? Car industry, let's say people were really efficient, they were quick at making cars, so the labor was really great. That means that over time, these companies are going to be more willing to hire labor resources. So that actually helps our goal of full employment. Let's look at some examples now. So an example of aggregate supply policy is infrastructure. So definitely number one. In the short term, it can actually, it can cause inflation. It can increase the levels of growth and demand in the economy. But over the long term, it actually helps supply as well. So let's think about economic infrastructure, right? So stuff such as new rails, new ports, new roads, all of that would actually help suppliers transport their materials, transport their goods and services to consumers. So it makes it much more efficient. So a new road connecting Melbourne to Sydney that reduces the travel time, that would make labor much more, that would make transport very efficient. Again, it helps make it more efficient. It decreases production costs. So let's say you're having a driver deliver them. They're driving on that road from Melbourne to Sydney, and it now takes less time. That means that you can also pay them less, so reduce production costs. Okay, and that increases our productive capacity. Next, social infrastructure. So this is more about collective, like community services. So stuff like education shortages, labor bottlenecks, stuff that causes unemployment, and so on. So that's social infrastructure. Okay, another example is the National Saving Promotion. So this is about closing the savings and investment gap in Australia, right? So surpluses help increase those national savings. So, for example, budgetary policy surplus, it can cause crowding in. It means that there's less competition for credit, more borrowing, and so on, right? So there's more investment. Businesses are able to borrow money to invest. They can expand their production with this new investment, new capital, and it can boost aggregate supply. Next, trade liberalization. So this one is a pretty big thing. Let's say you have trade barriers, right? So let's say everything that you buy that's imported, you have to pay an extra tax on it. So essentially, it's more expensive to buy imports, right? That means that Australian industries don't have as much competition. They're not forced to be innovative. They're not forced to be creative. So they're not really incentivized to be super productive. But if we remove those trade barriers, if we remove them, this means that now Australian industries have extra competition from overseas. So they're forced to either be super productive, change the way that they produce and make sure that they can lower their prices, or they're going to go out of business. So trade liberalization, it can have positive effects if industries are able to cope with it and really reform their way of production. But if they're not able to, that can have negative effects because you're going to have Australian industries that start to shut down. They're not able to cope. It also brings me to the point of comparative advantage. So if we have trade liberalization, it means that now we have economies of scale, right? So each economy or each country produces things that it's good at producing and then trades them with others. So for example, Australia, we're really good at producing coal, iron ore, and all of that. And then because we produce lots and lots of that, we can spread out our costs over that. And it also gives us a comparative advantage. So let's say because we have such great natural resources, so for example, we have good access to coal, we have lots of land for agriculture, growing livestock and all of that. So that gives us a comparative advantage over another country. So for example, let's say Japan, which doesn't have as much land to work with. So this means that we have a comparative advantage to trade goods and services that we are good at producing. And then we can buy goods and services that other countries are good at producing. So for example, Japan is very, very well known for its good technology. So we can import their technology and we can export our agriculture, livestock and so on. So essentially, the point of trade liberalization is to try to get rid of protectionist policies. So policies that try to protect our industries from overseas industries. Okay, let's look at some of the protectionist policies. So tariffs is a big one. So that's when you have an indirect tax on imports. So this makes imports more expensive, people less willing to buy them. So that protects Australian industries. Subsidies, so payments to local industries to help them be more productive, improve their productive capacity. Again, it's protectionist because it's not really encouraging them to be super productive when they're just getting the payment and they're using that payment to continue production. Import quotas, so basically when you import something, the government's like, okay, you can only import 100 of this item and that's it. Anti-dumping legislation. So dumping it doesn't mean like you're importing stuff and they just dump it on the coast. No. So anti-dumping is basically if they get goods and services and they sell it below the cost price. So they're not making a profit, but they're trying to kill off the other industries. Capital or ownership restrictions. That's when you have restrictions on foreign investment in Australia. So people overseas are not as able to invest in Australian industries. Okay, so free trade agreements. That's when we're going closer to trade liberalization. So let's say we have trade agreements, right? Free trade agreements. First thing that happens is the protectionist policies, they sort of are dismantled. So the Australian industries are exposed to overseas competition, okay? And now they're really forced to be efficient and really forced to just change the way they produce, be super, super productive so they can compete with the people overseas. But, okay, so they're supposed to be super efficient, they lower their production costs. Again, this is an ideal situation. Lower their production costs, make sure they produce more and more goods and services. this increases our aggregate demand because now things are cheaper, people are more willing to buy them. Okay, inflation. So there's lots and lots of competition, which means that Australian industries ideally are super efficient and reduce their costs. So it can actually keep inflation sustainable. External stability. So we increase our international trade because we are internationally competitive now. So we've lowered our prices, we're being productive, and our goods start to appeal to international industries. So this increases our exports and increases our market share. Also, increased exports increase aggregate demand. Employment. So in the short term, we have higher structural unemployment because there's some industries which aren't able to compete with overseas. So that can actually cause structural unemployment. But in the long term, hopefully, if these industries are able to adapt, able to be super productive, be competitive, we can have increased employment. Equity, so we have decreased inflation, increased real income. So because as we become more productive, we the gap between inflation and our wage growth is sort of smaller. Employment issues, so basically in the short term, obviously more unemployment, but in the long term, there's less people who are unemployed. So people who are really skilled will stay employed. Okay, so an example of free trade is the CPTPP. So that's basically a partnership with Japan, and it's basically beef tariff reductions to Japan. So we're removing our cheese tariffs, we're removing the beef tariffs, so that it's more easy for us to sell our goods and services overseas. Okay. We're also giving online education, so we're providing online education. So, for example, uni education to people overseas. So, so that's an example of a service. So basically, we're trying to make trade a little bit more free, trying to remove those protectionist policies. Industry policy. So this is to correct our market failure so that we can have a more optimal investment on different resources. So an example of that is tax concessions for businesses that invest in R&D. So R&D is research and development. So research and development is really good, and it's something that has a positive externality, and it's underproduced. So research and development, it doesn't have immediate gain, right? So people undertake research and development. It takes a long time to actually figure something out. But when they do, it can actually help make production much more efficient. Example is in farming. So if we have genetically modified food, if we have genetically modified produce, it actually grows much quicker. And if we can do research and development to make it sustainable, grow in a safe way, then it's actually it's a breakthrough for production. So it can be really useful. We just need to make sure that we invest in it. So this is from, again, this year's budget, investing in a more productive and safer digital future. Okay, so this helps businesses access more safe, more productive digital technologies. So this will allow them to make sure that the services they provide are much more efficient. They're not subject to scams or anything that would slow it down. This one's a really good example. So education is a great aggregate supply policy. So if we invest in skills and training, we are reducing the level of structural unemployment. So for example, if the government is funding free TAFE courses and subsidizing VCE courses, subsidizing uni courses, it can actually help upskill a lot of people. So these 300,000 people who study a TAFE course with skills that are in demand by employers, they are likely to be employed. They're likely to be productive. They're likely to have the skills to do the job really well. Okay, and this actually helps and makes the level of production really efficient. It increases our productive capacity because we now have 300,000 more people who are skilled enough to take on different roles, so to complete different tasks that are in demand. Boosting skilled migration. So this is another really great example. If we're having more skilled migrants coming into Australia and applying their skills to the workforce, it actually means that we're much more productive again. So it means that we're able to work much more productively. It means that we can, these migrants can use those skills to improve the productivity in the workplace. Okay, so if workers are really productive, and if businesses in general can be super productive, it reduces real unit production costs. So what that means is, so overall, let's say a business has to pay $1,000 to produce, let's say a business is paying $1,000 to all of its workers for producing 100 items, right? So each item has a cost of about $10. But if these workers become super productive, they upskill, they're more skilled now, and they can do the task much more quickly, but to the same standard. And they can now, these employees are able to produce 1,000 items instead of just 100. They're lowering the unit production costs to $1. So it would make a significant impact on the business's ability to, I guess, lower prices and keep costs low.